The Warburgs are the largest banking clan in the world. What is remarkable about him? What did he do in the past and is he doing now? Sit back, now you will see everything, and without exaggeration, you will be shocked by the information at the end of the issue. Before talking about the Warburgs, we note that it is impossible to consider the banking behind the scenes without family ties, since most of these clans have entered into interclan marriages for centuries. This is exactly how, since the 19th, and partly since the 18th century, a close-knit international banking network was created, consisting of close and distant relatives. There is this figure: interrelated marriages accounted for half of the 59 marriages entered into by the Rothschilds in the 19th century. It used to be that men married their first and second cousins. Of course, not only relatives were selected as a profitable party, connections within the top officials of the banking business were also strengthened. Although, in essence, this was the absorption of certain dynasties into the largest banking clan, including a change of surname in the male line. For example, the daughter of the royal court banker of Bavaria and Prussia, Sicilian and Austrian consul general Karl Rothschild, married Maximilian Goldschmidt, a native of the Frankfurt banking family, and he immediately became Baron Goldschmidt Rothschild. Here is another such example. The representative of the oldest English family, the flower of the Jewish aristocracy Abraham Montefiore, who grew up with the daughter of Amschel Rothschild, was asked to change his surname to Rothschild in order to be admitted to financial affairs. Later, this Montefiore Rothschild became a monopoly banking overseer over all of Australia. And the marriage of Kalman Rothschild with Adelheid Hertz, the future favorite of the Neapolitan king, in 1818, provided the Rothschilds with not only a business, but also an indirect family connection with the Oppenheimers, while each of the marriages increased their aristocratic status, which was a deliberate intra-family policy. Once again they raised their status in 1814 when they became related to the Warburgs. Now let's take a closer look at this clan. This Sephardic family, who bore the telling name Del Banco, came from Venice, where they were one of the richest. But it was the Venetian Jewish diaspora that became the cradle of the modern world financial elite. The richest and largest in Europe is the Venetian Jewish financial group living compactly, in one city. But due to its historical connections with other regions, it controlled capital flows throughout Eurasia. Venice's economic position was based on usury and the slave trade in the Mediterranean. Then, due to many factors, the slave trade began to decline throughout Europe, and the weakening of the Venetian Republic served as an impetus for the exodus of Jews from Venice to the northern countries of Europe. At the same time, the resettlement of Jews and the flight of their capital did not occur chaotically, but under the control of the so-called Venetian Party. The financiers of this structure worked on the future of their capital, and as part of these events in the 16th century, part of the clan in question moved to Scandinavia and England. However, the Copenhagen branch of the family retains the Venetian surname Del Banco. The other part of the family moves to Germany, settling in the city of Warburg. In this case, migrants changed their real name to the name of the city in which they decided to stay. Quite ambitious, isn't it? Some 220 years ago, representatives of this German branch of the clan, the brothers Moses and Gershon, the newly minted Warburgs, founded the Warburg & Co. Bank. During the reign of Sigmund and Moritz, two nephews of Moses, one of the founders, the bank became the first among private banks in Europe. Next, the Warburgs expand their influence, they found banks in London and New York. One of the nephews, Moritz Warburg, in turn, marries into the Oppenheimer clan. 5 sons from this marriage to Charlotte Esther Oppenheimer, ABI, Max, Paul, Felix, and Fritz become the Magnificent Five, as they were called in Germany. All 5 were born in Hamburg and graduated from high school there. And instead of higher education, they did internships in the banks of their clan. Only ABI studied at universities, but he did not become a banker, more on that later. One of the brothers of this Magnificent Five, Max Warburg, continues the family business. In addition to leading the bank, he was an advisor to Kaiser Wilhelm before the First World War. In 1918, he was offered to join the government as Minister of Finance. He refuses, believing that he will inevitably be perceived as an agent of large Jewish capital. Among other things, Max Warburg served on the General Council of the Reichsbank, that is, the German Central Bank, from 1924 to 1933. During the 1930s, Max and his bank played an important role in the implementation of the Havre Agreement concluded in 1933 between the Jewish Agency and the Nazi government. This was the beginning of a plan to resettle German Jews in Palestine, which ultimately led to the creation of the State of Israel. Max was also on the board of the Farben Industrie Chemical Syndicate, the most important corporation of the Third Reich. In 1938, he emigrated to the USA, which saved him from persecution by the Nazis, and also from the post-war trial to which all the leaders of the syndicate were subjected. Let's travel with him across the ocean and look at another brother from the Magnificent Five, Paul Warburg. Meet the father of the U.S. Federal Reserve System. At the age of 27, he marries Nina Loeb, daughter of one of the founders of the New York bank Kuhn, Loeb and Company, Kuhn Loeb and Company. Solomon Loeb. Thus he became the brother-in-law of the director of this bank, the famous Jacob Schiff, who was married to another daughter of Solomon, Teresa. In 1902, Paul moved to the United States and began working for his father-in-law's banking company. In 1910, he already participated in a secret meeting of leading bankers, at which the concept of the U.S. Federal Reserve System was developed, presented to the U.S. Congress in the form of a report. After Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act in 1914, Paul was chosen as one of the first 5 members of the Central Bank's board. Does it make sense to explain that the U.S. Federal Reserve is a private banking firm that stands above the official authorities of America? Let me know by liking and commenting whether it is worth making a separate issue on it, otherwise it seems that every school child already knows about it. But that's not all. Here's another important detail. In 1929, the so-called The Council on Foreign Relations acquires its own building. A significant share of the funds for this purchase was contributed by the then director of this council, the same Paul Warburg, and John Rockefeller contributed the rest. What is the Council on Foreign Relations, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and the like? This is, in fact, a think tank, the largest closed-order structure of the American elite. From 45 to 72, about 45% of foreign policy positions in the U.S. government were part-time members of this structure. Joining it was essentially a rite of passage for any foreign policy figure. And the CIA, the most famous U.S. intelligence agency, worked for the first decades of its existence under the leadership of members of this council, such as Allen Dulles, John McCone, William Colby, and others. Paul Warburg also founded the Carl Schurz Foundation, which was one of those structures where the idea of controlling the planet's population was matured. Knowing all this, the words of Paul Warburg's son, James Warburg, who in 1950 said the following are not surprising. We will get a world government whether we like it or not. The only question is how the world government will be created, by agreement or by conquest. Let's move on to the third brother, Felix Warburg, who was born just under 150 years ago. He moved to the United States in 1894, in the same year he married Frieda Schiff, the daughter of Jacob Schiff, and also began working for the already mentioned company Kuhn, Loeb & Co., of which his father-in-law was president and in which his older brother Paul already worked. Felix co-founded the American Jewish Distribution Fund, JDC, contributed to the development of Jewish settlements in Eretz Israel, and supported the Palestine Economic Corporation and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. In 1927, he visited the USSR as one of the leaders of the Agro-Joint Project, visited 40 Jewish settlements in Crimea and Ukraine, created thanks to this project. What was this project? The creation of Crimean Israel, which is not commonly remembered now. In 1929, an agreement was concluded under which the Soviet Union received about $1.5 million annually from the joint. In exchange, 375,000 hectares of Crimean land were pledged, registered in shares, the buyers of which were more than 200 U.S. citizens, including the well-known Roosevelt, Hoover, Rockefeller, and Marshall. In 1936, after the Soviet state received a total of $20 million, this project, called Crimean California, was closed and forgotten, and the funds stopped flowing. The issue was returned to in 1943 at the Tehran Conference, when Roosevelt informed Stalin that his administration would soon have problems with supplies to the USSR under Lend-Lease if the Crimean California project was not revived. In 1954, the deadline for returning the money received for New California came. According to one version, the transfer of Crimea to the jurisdiction of Ukraine, whose leadership, by the way, had long opposed such an idea of Nikita Khrushchev, was supposed to complicate the Americans' attempt to make demands for the transfer of the territory of the peninsula that had been pledged to them. The fourth, older brother traded bank fraud for books. Abi Warburg did not like the Jewish religious rituals that were scrupulously observed in the family, and he early rejected all career plans related to banking. He also did not want to be either a doctor or a lawyer. Abi, when he was 13 years old, did not hesitate to make a deal with his brother Max, who was 12 years old, agreeing to forfeit his right as the eldest son to become the head of the family bank in exchange for Max's obligation to provide him with all the books in which he would need. Years later, Abi would become the founder of a huge art library, more than 300,000 volumes, which would become the London Institute named after him. He studied archaeology, art history, psychology, history of religion in Bonn, Munich, Strasbourg. He defended his doctoral dissertation on two masterpieces by Botticelli. In 1895, Abi made a long trip to the United States, where he devoted a lot of time to studying the culture of the Hopi Native American tribe. In 1897, he married, against his father's will, the artist Maria Hertz, the daughter of a Hamburg senator and member of the Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church. Abi settled with his wife in Florence, where their friends were famous writers, artists, sculptors, and art historians. The fifth brother, Fritz Warburg, the youngest of the famous five, created a metal exchange in Hamburg and a corresponding department in the bank. Fritz always had Jewish friends, he loved to speak Yiddish and loved stories about life in Jewish shtetls. All Jewish traditions were observed in his family, and the brothers called Fritz their Jewish conscience. After the death of his father, he headed the Jewish community of Hamburg. It should be noted that the wealthy Hanseatic city of Hamburg became a refuge for many European Jews. The most powerful Jewish community in Germany arose in Hamburg. The Germans still call the narrow but extremely influential Jewish stratum Kaiserjuden, Imperial Jews. Fritz and his family left Hamburg for Sweden in August 1938, immediately after Max left for New York. But a month later I went back to Hamburg. But at this time the situation in Germany after Kristallnacht had changed dramatically, and when Fritz was supposed to return to Sweden a couple of days later, the Gestapo arrested him at the airport. He spent more than 6 months in prison along with 700 other arrested Jews from his Hamburg community. Fritz was saved by the German banker Cornelius von Berenberg-Gossler, with whom he was on the board of directors of the National German Bank. Cornelius managed to negotiate a deal in Berlin with Himmler's assistant Heydrich in which Fritz would ransom 100 Jews before sending them and him to Sweden. At the end of his life, Fritz moved to Israel, where he died in a kibbutz, the last of the famous 5 Warburg brothers. This is the kind of clan that they definitely don't talk about in history lessons, although he had more influence on history than some public rulers. Well, at the end there is the promised intrigue. What are the Warburgs doing now? Let's get a look. Here is Bettina Warburg, giving lectures on the topic of blockchain. So she says that the only thing that separates us from a bright crypto future is mistrust. After everything you saw in this short episode, Do you think blockchain is truly the bright future of the entire planet? And all these cryptocurrencies are really the invention of honest anonymous programmers, capable, like Neo, of destroying the matrix? Write in the comments what you think about this topic. Thank you for watching, and if the episode was thought-provoking, please give it a fair rating so we know our efforts were not in vain. See you soon.